So I prepared something here that I am, I'm calling French Lexicon Creoles a worldview, right? Can everybody see the screen? Can you just nod? Let me know that you're seeing. Let me know, Danielle. All right, great. Yeah, a worldview. And I am talking about worldview in two senses. So first, I want to just literally talk about where French Lexicon Creoles are spoken in the world. In your invitation, you said that I should speak briefly about the structure. So I'll just do that very briefly. But more importantly, I want to talk about a philosophical worldview, which you touched on in your video, all right? You specifically about why it matters and what type of worldview we should have as linguists, but because this presentation is for young budding linguists, what type of worldview you should have as linguists coming up in the Caribbean towards French Lexicon Creoles. The raw numbers themselves are staggering, and I don't think people know them. French Lexicon Creoles can be found all over the world. It is the most widely spoken Creole in the Caribbean by far. So for example, you have more than 35 million Creole speakers of all lexifiers in the Caribbean. And about 12 million of those speakers are French Lexicon Creole speakers. 11 million or so of them are from Haiti, but we have speakers, of course, from different parts of the Caribbean, the Insular Caribbean, as well as the Continental Caribbean. So we're talking about 12 point something million speakers in the Caribbean region alone, excluding places outside of the Caribbean. So for that reason alone, it means we should pay some attention to this language. All varieties of this language. In the Insular Caribbean, we have Haiti, and of course, the Haitians who are in the Dominican Republic, so that should be included. We have Guadeloupe and all of the dependencies, Martinique and St. Lucia, Dominica, Martinique, St. Lucia, and residual communities in Grenada and Trinidad. So when we talk about the Insular Caribbean, or the islands of the archipelago, that we basically have many different territories where French Creole is spoken. We also have French Creole territories in the continental Caribbean. So we have a St. Lucian community in Guyana, for example, and Prof perhaps can answer some questions on that later because he did some research on that. And then we have French Guyana as well, where French Creole is spoken. And then staying in the region of South America as well as Central America, in Brazil, you have Caripuna, right? You have French Creole spoken there. You have quite a few French Creole communities there. You have a MAPA, which I don't know too much about. I mean, I have done some work on Caripuna. And then you even have smaller communities of people from Brazil and from Guyana and other parts of the Caribbean. So certain insulated French Creole communities in Venezuela and in Panama that have been documented and studied. In North America, we have Louisiana. So you have Louisiana French Creole. So that covers the entire America, all of the Americas as we know them, right? Including well, the Caribbean, which is part of the Americas. And then on the other side of the world, French Lexicon Creole is also widely spoken. So in France, outside of French itself, it is the most widely spoken language regionally. Because you have many departments of France with different varieties of French Lexicon Creole. You have many speakers of French Lexicon Creole in France itself. So that is to be considered. We also have to consider Africa, the Pacific Ocean, as well as the Indian Ocean. So in Africa, there are about two historical French pidgins. That's how it's recorded in the literature. But one right now that is still documented and is being studied in Burundi. And then we have the Indian Ocean close to Madagascar. That is where my map drop is there. Several islands that are departments of France or former colonies of France where French Lexicon Creole is spoken. So Seychelles, Réunion, Mauritius, Rodriguez, etc. And then, of course, I put an arrow to show in the Pacific Ocean, we have New Caledonia. So there's lots of information on all of these French Creole spoken on that side of the world. You can go to the Atlas of Pidgins and Creoles, for example, and get summaries there. In terms of the structure of the language, we know that a lot of the Creole languages in the Caribbean are influenced, or even though we don't like the term substrata and you know so much anymore, but they are influenced by West African languages, or some of the languages that they came into contact with. European languages come into contact, as you rightfully mentioned in your intro video, into contact with West African languages. And what we will find if we compare, for example, the phonology of these languages, is that French Creole has a vowel system that includes about 7 oral vowels. Generally, most French Creoles have about 7 oral vowels. And these are the same vowels systems that you will find in the West African languages that are part of the origin of French Creole, right? In terms of the parents, so to speak, languages coming into contact. So they're less like the European lexifiers and more like the West African languages like Fongbe, etc., that influence it. And I just showed one table here to show that. In terms of phonology as well, sorry, we also need to talk, French Creole has nasal phonemes. So in addition to our oral vowels, we also have nasal phonemes. And I have a clip here from the St. Lucian Creole Dictionary, edited by David Frank, where you have and right? So these are all nasal phonemes as well. And of course, when I say phonemes, just because we have some linguistic students here, just to make sure we are clear, I don't know if you remember your intro to phonetics and phonology, but you can form minimal pairs with these, right? So they will contrast in analogous and identical environments and form minimal pairs. So that's how we know that they are nasal phones, as opposed to English, for example, which has nasalization. So if I say the word like man, for example, there may be some nasal quality on the vowel sound there simply because it's surrounded by two nasal consonants. But we have distinct phonemes in French Creole that are nasal phonemes, that are vowels, nasal vowels. The most significant thing I would say there's just too much to talk about in terms of French Creole syntax. But I would say the first thing you will learn, and as Daniel rightfully mentioned, he did the course with me last year. The very first thing we will delve into is that if you're in terms of Creole syntax, is that nouns and verbs in Creole or in most Creole languages, they're always bare or they're always uninflected. So they're not inflected for number, and there's no grammatical gender. And of course, grammatical information is marked by preposed or postposed particles. So you have, say, potla, for example, the cups, where the se will be the pluralizer, the la, of course, being the definite article. And I have another example here, like moekale, where the verb ale, go, is uninflected, and there's a pre-verbal marker, which can either mean progressive aspect, continuing aspect. It's continuing every single day. Right now, it's ongoing right now, imperfective. So I am going, or it can be recurring, right? So habitually, I go habitually. So where English marks that with inflection, and where English uses the present tense, for example, or that form of the verb, just the bare verb by itself to refer to habitual aspect, you have a pre-verbal marker referring to habitual or recurring aspect. So that's just a little bit of syntactic information about French Creoles. But the more important question, more than what is the structure of French Creoles, and which, I mean, so many linguists have studied, and where Creole languages are spoken around the world, is why does all of this matter? Like, why study this? And I think it's very important because French Creole indexes Caribbean identity. So historically, French Creole really is the language of freedom, because Haiti was the first truly free and equal society in the Americas. So you had the American War of Independence, for example, the Declaration of Independence, of course, drafted the famous words, "We the people," I believe Thomas Jefferson, etc. But Haiti was the first society to proclaim every man equal, every single person equal. Right, there was no slavery, etc. When at the end of the Haitian Revolution, when Haiti took power from France. So really and truly, Haiti was a country that was with French Lexicon Creole as its main language. Haitian Creole as the lingua franca, the language of the people, was in fact the language of freedom, the language of a society that was truly free, and equal. And in terms of our contemporary societies, French Creole is an indelible part, has made an indelible mark on our culture. You have many native speakers of French Lexicon Creole in the Caribbean, and French Lexicon Creole in many ways is connected to our way of life. So let's consider, for example, Trinidad. I know most of the students will be watching this presentation are from Trinidad and would have heard John Jacob Thomas. So he's a Trinidadian linguist, and he wrote the very first grammar of French Lexicon Creole. And he did that because French Lexicon Creole for a very long time, for almost a century really, was the lingua franca of Trinidad and Tobago. So well into the late 19th century, French Lexicon Creole was the lingua franca and was spoken by people of every race in Trinidad and Tobago, more specifically Trinidad. And even though France never colonized Trinidad, there was immigration. So immigration was encouraged through the Spanish system. And as a result of that, immigrants from St. Kitts and other parts of the Caribbean came in, and then you ended up with French Lexicon Creole being the lingua franca of the island. So much so that the theory and practice of Creole grammar was written by John Jacob Thomas. So it is a part of our history. It's not, so even in Trinidad right now, where there are only traces, for example, in Paramin, where it is kept alive, and some of you had the privilege of meeting some of these Creole speakers in Paramin last year, it is a part of your history, and it is a part of your everyday speech right now, even though it's residual, like Mama Guy, etc. Your place names, and among other things. Of course, if you're speaking about Antillean identity, specifically the Lesser Antilles, French Lexicon Creole connects Martinique and Guadeloupe, that are departments of France, to St. Lucia and Dominica, that are independent, English official, but also have a French Lexicon Creole. So in many ways, we share with Martinique and Guadeloupe, even though we don't have the same official languages, even though St. Lucians and Dominicans speak English is the official language of these two territories, and Martinique and Guadeloupe have French official. The connection between the two islands is kept by the language, a cultural connection between the two islands. And in many ways, it separates Martinique and Guadeloupe from France, because Martinicans and residents of Guadeloupe, as well as all of the departments, can index their West Indian, their Antillean identities through French Lexicon Creole and all of the permutations of that, like Zouk and the music, etc. And that gives them an independent West Indian identity, right? So there's a lot of literature on that. I must talk about St. Lucia, of course, and Creole is by far and away the most patent index of what it means to be St. Lucian in many ways of our cultural identity. It is part of our cultural forms, our folklore, just like it is in many parts of the Caribbean, in Trinidad as well. And just one other example, a flower festival, so La Rose and La Marguerite, for example. It's part of our music. So we have Zouk, in addition to our folk songs, etc. We have Zouk, which we share with the French Antillean Islands. And then we also have Dennery segment, right? We have Moto and Teddyson John, who was featured here on my slide, with things like Palais and Vent, two songs that were popular in Trinidad. That's why I put him here. Because we have a lot of artists who are L1 speakers of French Creole, who are creating music in the language and in a way revitalizing the language, revitalizing interest in the language as well. So because French Creole is such a patent index of St. Lucian identity, infusing the language, creating music with the language makes the music uniquely St. Lucian, right? And we also have to consider the fact that in St. Lucia, especially people of the older generations, many of them, like my late grandmother, for example, are L1 speakers of French Lexicon Creole. That is the dominant language. That is the language that she spoke. That was the language that she used every single day. And wherever possible, even in official interactions, wherever somebody would engage her, she would use them in official interactions, right? So the question is why? Why does all of this matter? Well, now that we know the history, now that we know what it is, where do we go from there? What is the call for the Caribbean linguist? What is the call for you, for me, as somebody who's being groomed as a scholar in the area. If a prof, for example, who has done so much work in the area, and for you just studying and majoring in linguistics right now or doing a minor in linguistics, it's because there is a sort of unspoken divide that happens when in a society there is one official language, but there are unofficial dialects, or there are unofficial languages that are spoken by the speakers, who need access to public institutions. So because only in Haiti, French Lexicon Creole is official, and in all of the other territories in the Caribbean, French Lexicon Creole is unofficial, even though it's part of the culture, it's a way of life, it has many, many L1 speakers. These speakers need, especially if they do not have access in the official language, help. We need to create situations of not just equality, but equity, in which we provide them help to access public institutions. So we have to ask ourselves certain questions, questions, for example, about the education system. Are we considering the needs of L1 speakers of French Lexicon Creoles in schools? And that's where my research comes in specifically. So what are the experiences of these speakers in the classroom or in standardized examinations in a situation where, for example, the island might be English official, but they have a French Creole competence? We need to think about, and of course, Michel Legraf, among others, asked themselves that question in Haiti and came up with the very successful MIT Haiti initiative, in which students were taught even STEM programs and STEM courses like mathematics, science, etc., in their first language, which was Haitian Creole. And the results, we had an exponential increase in output in terms of results. So it is very important. We know for sure that it is important to have conversations about L1 speakers and of Creole and the experiences of L1 speakers of Creole in the classroom. And it's particularly important, perhaps, in territories like Dominica and St. Lucia, where the official language is a different lexifier altogether. We also have to have conversation about medicine and health communication. So can French Lexicon Creole speakers explain their symptoms to their doctors? So I have seen it myself, because my mom worked at a hospital. I remember once, and I was waiting for her, and there was somebody speaking to a doctor who was foreign. He didn't speak English, and then another nurse had to come in and interpret what the person was experiencing. We saw that happen during COVID. So during COVID, when it became important for every single person in St. Lucia, for example, to know very clearly what was required and what was going on with this global pandemic, it became apparent immediately that they had to have interpreters, translators, giving the information in Creole to make sure that every single person was clear about what needed to be done. So after the Prime Minister's briefing and the briefing by the Chief Medical Officer, we had certain Creole activists and French Creole interpreters giving all of the information again in French Creole. So it's important. It's really a matter of life and death in many situations. And then the law. So we can go on and on and on, but I will end with the law. So we need interpreters because there are many language rights. The law, for example, gives you the right to get the caution to have your rights read to you in a language that you understand. But in practice, there are many legal wrongs. In practice, an interpreter is not provided. It's left up to officers, for example, who see themselves as both officers but also interpreter because they speak the language, to read the rights or to take statements, for example, and often these statements misrepresent what people have said. So I saw this again myself. I worked in a district court in St. Lucia, and I was waiting for I translated from English to Spanish. That's what I did at the court, and I was waiting in the room to go up when my case was being heard to translate in Spanish. And there was a man speaking before me, just before me, there was a man speaking, and he said he spoke in French Creole. He spoke in French Creole, he said something in French Creole, and then he was asked to say it again, and then he tried to say it in English, but he did not represent what he had said in French Creole accurately. And I knew this because I speak French Creole and I was listening, and I knew that he had not represented himself properly in English, and it's because he was struggling. to represent himself properly in English. His first language, his mother tongue, his native language was very clearly French Creole. And I was sitting there thinking that the magistrate was Jamaican at the time, and the clerk, for example, interpreted for him in part. There was no official person in the role of interpreter. So in a way, his language rights were trumped by legal wrongs. So we need to have wider conversations about how French Lexicon Creole speakers experience our societies. And I could go on and on, in the bank, etc. But I just want to end here because I only have 15 minutes. I thank you for giving me the opportunity to just speak briefly, even though I feel very unqualified, especially coming before Professor Robertson to speak about any of this. And I'm glad to take any of your questions.